Hey, it's Mat McLachlan. Thanks for joining me on another walk through history. Today, something a little bit different. I'm going to be answering your questions, coming up right after this. Our first question comes from Karina Leech. Karina writes, I'm interested in battles around the 14th of November 1916 on the Somme. A cousin is listed on the Villers-Bretonneux Memorial as having died on this date. I'm also interested in your experiences exploring the battlefields. Are you surprised at something new each time you visit the Western Front? Well, the first part of your question, Karina, the 14th of November 1916. This was the battle around the town of Fleur on the Somme. It was a really terrible time for the Australian forces. They'd been enduring a really long and bitterly cold winter in the trenches and the mud around the Somme. And then in November they were called to make two attacks around the town of Fleur. So this was a really terrible time for the Australians, and many veterans of the war remembered this as absolutely the hardest period of the entire war for the Aussies. So it appears that your cousin was killed in that terrible fighting around the Battle of Fleur in November 1916. And it's not surprising he's listed on the Villers-Bretonneux Memorial, because that's the memorial for all our missing men in France. So many men went into this action and never came out again. So without knowing specifically the details of your cousin, I would say that was the campaign in which he was killed. The second part of your question, my experiences on the battlefields, do I find something new on the Western Front? Every time I go to the Western Front, I uncover something new. There's always a fantastic new story to learn, or a new action that I haven't explored before. Even your uncle's story, your cousin's story, that's something interesting and new that I didn't know about before. So I love getting over there. Each time I go to the battlefields, there's something new I want to discover. I usually go with a new purpose or some new research in mind, and I absolutely love walking the battlefields. It's always a new adventure. Todd Sheaves writes, what would your guidelines to behaviour in military cemeteries and battlefields? What should people do and what shouldn't they do? It's a great question, Todd, and I think it's important that when we visit these places, we do so with an appropriate level of respect. But I also think it's important that we don't overdo it. And we should remember why these cemeteries were built in the first place. When they were constructed in the 1920s, the people that created them had absolutely no idea that 100 years later, thousands and thousands of people would still be coming to pay their respects. When these cemeteries were built, they were built for the families of the men who lie in them. And particularly from the UK, when it was quite easy to catch a ferry from the UK to France and go and visit the grave of a loved one. And so they knew that thousands of pilgrims would be coming every year to visit these cemeteries, and they wanted them to be accessible. So, for example, today, if you have tried to eat food or have a drink in a cemetery, people would look at you and think that that's maybe a little bit disrespectful. But if you look at the cemeteries, often they have a little seating area built into the wall or a little bench in the corner. And that's specifically for that reason. It was so that family members, when they came, they could pay their respects to their loved one, and then they could sit and have a bite to eat and spend some time observing the cemetery, enjoying the surrounds, and being closer to their loved one. So I think we've got to be careful about not being too precious about these places and turning them into cathedrals or churches. These are places of remembrance, but also we should remember that they're designed so that we can go and share our feelings with the men that lie there. Another really good example is at Tynecott Cemetery in Belgium. There's a big monument, the Cross of Sacrifice, is built on the top of a German bunker. And when I go there, particularly with school groups, I encourage the kids to climb up on top of that memorial and look out across the battlefields. And people often say to me, isn't that disrespectful to have children clambering all over a memorial? But when you look closely, there are actually steps built into the side of the memorial. That was the intention of the builders of that cemetery, that people would climb up on that memorial and look out over the battlefields. So in answer to your question, I think yes, certainly be respectful of the fact that this is a cemetery, but also don't get too precious about it. And I think we should allow people to respond to this very emotional experience in their own way. Pauline Burrows Booth writes, can you travel to Zillah Beck in Belgium? My great uncle is buried there. Pauline, absolutely. Zillah Beck is near the town of Ypres in Belgium. It's right in the heart of the battlefields. And when you go and visit the battlefields of the Ypres salient, which were famous throughout the war, but particularly in 1917, Zillah Beck is right in the heart of that location. Probably the most famous site in that area is Hill 60, and Hill 60 was a scene of a lot of mining and a lot of underground work that was done during the war, and was made famous in the movie and book Beneath Hill 60, which came out a few years ago. So absolutely, you can visit Hill 60, you can visit Zillah Beck. We do it on every tour that goes up to the Ypres salient area. Phil Hodgson writes, any possibility of a Crimean battlefield tour and to Kiev 1 and 2? Absolutely. We have sent people there in the past. It's not an area where we would typically do an organised tour because the demand isn't there for a regular departure, but we have sent people there quite regularly for their own exploring in the company of a guide, and it's a really fascinating area. It's not one I've been to myself. I'm looking forward to getting over there at some stage, but it's somewhere we can certainly organise to send people to as part of a private tour. The whole Eastern Front battlefield from World War II is getting more and more popular. And we're sending a lot of people now to Russia and explore those areas. The only thing I'd say about Crimea at the moment is it's a bit politically unstable with trouble between the Ukraine and Russia. But once that stabilises a little bit, we expect to be sending more people back there. Marie Claire White writes, have you visited any German cemeteries? My great uncle is buried in one and I would love to visit his final resting place one day. I visited lots of German cemeteries. They're absolutely fascinating. Looking a little bit here, Marie, your specific query, I see what you're actually asking about is your uncle is buried in a Commonwealth military cemetery within Germany, which is a whole another story. So when it comes to German cemeteries where German soldiers are buried, they're absolutely incredible places, and I would recommend that everyone take the opportunity to visit one. If you're in all parts of Europe and you see a German cemetery, I would definitely recommend you go there. But specifically, Marie, your query about your great uncle, I've done a little bit of research. Private William Nahn, his name was. He was actually captured at Mouquet Farm in August 1916. So that was a big battle for the Australians just near Pozières. He was sent back to Germany as a prisoner of war. He had been wounded during that battle, however, and the wound got infected and he didn't recover from that injury. He died of illness several months later in a German hospital. So that was the unfortunate story of your uncle, and like so many thousands of Australians who are now buried in Germany who were captured during the war and unfortunately passed away as prisoners. David Cooper writes, how do I become a battlefield tour guide? It's a great question, David, and one I get asked quite a lot. I think if you're someone who has a passion for military history, you should absolutely do, follow your dreams. Try and do whatever you can to pursue that if you want to. It's exactly what I did. I was just someone who had an interest in military history, and now I've been very fortunate that it's my career. What I would say is that over the last decade, there's been a shift in the way that tour guides work and the types of tour guides that we look for. When we started doing these battlefield tours about 10 years ago, the battlefield historians that we employed all came from Australia, and we would send them on a group tour over to the battlefields. And that was simply because they were the only good guides that we could find, were all Australians. There's been a shift over the last decade, and now there are many excellent guides who actually live in the battlefield areas. And these are people we use more and more on our tours, simply because they're there every day. They know the history, they know the battlefields inside and out, and it's they just make the best guides. So if you are serious about becoming a battlefield historian, a battlefield tour guide, I would suggest that you really do need to live in the area that you are interested in guiding, whether that be France or Belgium or the UK or Germany or even Vietnam, parts of Asia. If you're really serious about doing it as a career, it would be a very good idea to actually move there and live there full time and guide tours. Having said that, what do you require to become a battlefield tour guide, whether you're someone who travels from Australia or someone who lives in the battlefield? There's really three things. Firstly, you need to know the history. Obviously, you need to know the history inside and out, and you need to know the history for the market that you are targeting. So if you are a guide to the Western Front battlefields, you'll want to know about the Australian history if your target market is Australians. In addition to that, you need to know the ground very well. So you need to have spent time walking around. The job of a historian or a tour guide is to relate what happened historically with what you can see on the ground today. So walking the ground and knowing the sites is very, very important. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, you need to be a great storyteller. It's no good having all the knowledge if you can't convey it. So we're always looking for people on our tours who are just brilliant storytellers who can really bring that history to life, because at the end of the day, that's what a battlefield tour is all about. Louise Kate writes, looking for best resources for maps of battles in Israel for the 5th Light Horse, please. Louise, that's a really specific question, a really good one too. I haven't actually researched specifically maps for the 5th Light Horse in the Palestine campaign, so I can't specifically point you in the direction of a resource, except to say that the number one spot for maps and any documentation to do with an Australian battle is definitely the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. So when I wrote both of my books, Walking with the Anzacs and Gallipoli, the Battlefield Guide, I spent dozens of hours in the archives of the War Memorial going over maps for specific actions that I was researching. So the War Memorial has an incredible treasure trove of maps for just about every Australian action you'd be interested in exploring. The maps don't tend to be digitised as much as other records, so it may require you to actually go to the War Memorial and visit the research centre, but they're the one-stop shop for everything to do with maps and documentation to do with Australian actions around the world. That's it for the questions. Thank you so much for sending them in, and I hope my answers have inspired you to do some research and to maybe visit the battlefields yourself one day. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and also visit us on Facebook. Until next time, thanks for watching.